honorable members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real privilege for me to be able to address you today on the topic of Iran-Iraq relations following the nuclear deal. The so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was signed less than a year ago, and the economic sanctions lifted barely 4 months ago. So the consequences of the deal are literally still unfolding as we speak. There are various stages also of the deal itself, which will kick in several years down the road. The first landmark is perhaps in less than 5 years when the arms embargo against Iran will be lifted. I suspect that all these landmarks will have yet another impact on the region. So, in other words, I was a little bit reminded of Chairman Mao when he was asked about the French Revolution, what he thought of it, and he quipped, well, it's too soon to tell. Now, I'm not suggesting we need to wait another century, but this is obviously a dynamic story and in development. But I think there are a number of facts on the ground and trends that can already be identified. No doubt the nuclear agreement was perhaps one of the most consequential foreign policy issues in a generation. Unfortunately, it ultimately failed in what it had set out to do, originally, namely to really curtail Iran's nuclear ambitions. The deal abandoned the earlier negotiation position of dismantling sanctions only in exchange for the dismantling of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, and instead it replaced it with what is a mere temporary freeze on parts of Tehran's program. So the P5+1 thus in fact validated Iran's future status as a nuclear threshold state. And this, no doubt, dramatically shifted the balance of power in the region to Tehran's favor, particularly as it was coupled with the sort of continued disengagement of the U.S. From the Middle East. In addition, the lifting of sanctions, and again here the full repercussions of it have not yet materialized, but they will undoubtedly greatly benefit the Iranian economy, and free up billions of cash, while Western engagement, which started immediately following the conclusions of the negotiations, further enhances Tehran's standing, including obviously in Iraq, as the dominant regional power. This is why the deal raised so many alarm bells among Iran's anxious neighbors, and many of them are rivals across the Gulf. One of the repercussions down the road could be that it may trigger a nuclear arms race, or may have already done it without us necessarily having the full intelligence. But no doubt it has already, and the anticipation of the deal has already advanced a conventional arms race, and bringing the threat level in a region that is already very volatile to a whole new level. Saudi Arabia has recently become the world's second largest arms importer. The United Arab Emirates is number 4. So the deal is fueling the already violent Sunni-Shia divide, which is of course playing itself out already, particularly in Iran. Now, what will Iran do with this new enhanced power, militarily, economically, politically? Some proponents of the deal argue that Iran's very willingness to sign the agreement and the recent election victory of so-called moderates point to an opening of the regime, and so perhaps the possibility that Iran will use its enhanced powers, to put it simply, for the good of the region as such, or as a responsible player. Unfortunately, the facts on the ground tell a different story. Both internal oppression and external aggression have increased since the election of President Rouhani, who is less of a moderate as a real regime insider from the very beginning. who seeks the same goals as the so-called hardliners, but is simply perhaps more pragmatic about how he goes about it. So the Islamic Republic remains a revolutionary regime which uses military and political proxies, terrorism, bribes, and occasionally old-fashioned diplomacy to further its dominance in the region and certainly also in Iraq. And Iran's Iraq strategy has been, certainly since the toppling of Saddam Hussein, and later another boost came with the withdrawal of U.S. forces, to unite Iraq's Shiite party so that they can translate the demographic weight into political influence. It has backed a range of disparate parties and movements to maximize its options, ensure its interests are advanced no matter which party may be in government or of influence. So the deal, which basically enshrines Iran as a future or de facto already nuclear threshold state on the cusp of an economic bonanza, greatly enhances Iran's ability to use all these levers of influence in Iraq. Any Iranian windfall from the agreement would allow Iran to intensify its basically influence buying in Iraq at this very critical moment, obviously, for Iraq. Take the military factor, for instance. No doubt the Iranian-backed popular mobilization units have contributed to Iraqi successes against ISIS. Some of these most powerful units, though, are US-designated terrorist groups with direct command and logistical ties to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps force. And while they have at times been effective against ISIS, they have also themselves committed grave war crimes against Sunni populations, fueling the sectarian violence. It is not unimaginable that with an economic boost as a result of the lifting of the sanctions, Tehran could at some point outspend Washington as Baghdad's main security partner. According to data, the U.S. is probably going to invest $700 million this year for the Iraq Train and Equip Fund. This is not necessarily beyond the reach of Iran's means. And if it indeed were to do that, it would really change the balance between the formal Iraqi security forces and these foreign-backed militia forces. As has happened in the past, Iranian proxies who are in control of these popular mobilization units may try to translate their role in the war into political currency. Perhaps during next year's provincial elections or parliamentary elections in 2018. And as is true with elections also here in the Western world, money talks also in Iraqi political contests. According to U.S. estimates, Iran spent in 2010 about $100 million to strengthen its proxies there during the 2000 election campaign. So in the upcoming elections, Iran could easily top that, perhaps, and we could see some very hardline former PMU commanders suddenly becoming political candidates, and again change perhaps the balance between moderate Shiite political forces and those really closely linked to Iran. Obviously, there are many other fields in which Iran could use its increased spending capacity to increase its influence, be it the media. There's an Iranian Arab language television service. There is, of course, the trade relationship. Iran is already the greatest trade partner and is subsidizing electricity and could expand its sort of dominance also in the economic field quite easily. So in conclusion, simply geography, culture, history that we have all discussed will mean that Iran will most likely remain the most important foreign influence in Iran. And what the nuclear deal probably did more than anything else is to confirm the Iranian narrative, and it is perhaps not just a narrative, it's more and more reality, that it is a rising power, that the US is perhaps in decline, that's certainly Tehran's view, and that the great powers, including also the EU, submitted in these negotiations to Tehran's will. And by using funds now available as a result of the lifting of the sanctions, it can provide even more military influence, political influence, and thus really cement its position in Iraq. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, and we appreciate your observations. Obviously, this is a very important and historic deal that has been struck, and the full implications have to be teased out, not just within the European context and for all of the member states of the European Union, but especially within the region, to see exactly how this will play out, how this will work, and the other potential negative consequences that could flow as a consequence of this deal. I was interested in your observations, especially on how the balance between Shia and Sunni is going to play out, and also how Iran itself will use this additional influence it now has collectively as a consequence of the deal to use its power within the region, and how that will play out. I think there are huge issues for Europe in this. There's huge issues for the United States, obviously, but also in terms of how that deal can play out and what kind of consequences we are likely to see. So we really appreciate your observations and the evidence you've given us. So I'm going to ask our chairperson to take the floor at this point, because he has a number of points he'd like to make. David.
Mr. Vice Chairman, Brian, parliamentary colleagues, distinguished guests, thank you for this. I was speaking now in a personal capacity, and I thought it was obviously the professional thing to do is not to chair and speak personally. So obviously I like to keep the two separate and to be neutral as chairman. So I'd like to thank Daniel first for his insightful remarks. I'll probably echo a number of those in my comments. He does raise some key concerns when discussing Iranian influence in the region. We've discussed in previous meetings of this delegation the role Iran is playing in the fight against ISIS in Iraq, and of course that is welcome. But I do think we should scrutinise it with significant caution. As Danny said, some of these groups are on the US most wanted lists, terrorist lists. Iran's long-standing ties with many Iraqi politicians and groups, Shia connections and others, risk undermining and further destabilising Iraq's fragile parliamentary and government structures, as we saw just this last week, the parliament being stormed effectively by Mr. al-Sadr, who has history in terms of Basra and the British participation there. We lost troops to some of Mr. al-Sadr's soldiers. Iraq and its security should have occupied a central part of the discussion regarding the nuclear agreement, in my opinion. However, our Iraqi friends were sadly overlooked. I share the fears of Gulf Arab states that Tehran, now boosted by the relaxation of economic sanctions, will try and expand and further consolidate its hegemonic grip over the Middle East. Hegemony, the Iranian hegemony, will above all affect Iraq where Tehran has for some time tried to install a puppet government in thrall to it, hindering the formation of a viable democratic system in its western neighbour. The growing power of Tehran-backed Shia groups fighting ISIS has been touched on, the Popular Mobilization Units, or PMUs, are germs of an attempt to plant an Iranian deep state in Iraq, similar to that of Hezbollah in Lebanon, arguably, rebel groups in Yemen, and its emerging alliance with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Obviously, Iran does like to play a strong regional role, and it's part of the historic game has been to destabilise Iraq, which obviously is one of its largest neighbours and potentially hostile neighbours, as we saw in that 8-year war. Now, David Petraeus, who commanded US troops in Iraq during 2007-08, has even voiced concern over reports of sectarian atrocities committed by the Shia PMUs, specific al-Hashad and al-Shabi. Human Rights Watch has also reported looting and vandalism of Iraqi Sunni property by these PMUs. We should consider the real prospect that when ISIS, I think it is when ISIS, is eventually driven out of Iraq, particularly if Mosul falls, God willing, shortly, the consequences may be that the Iranian-backed militias emerge as the most dominant force in Iraq, eclipsing the Iraqi security forces. Danny made that point, much as Hezbollah does in Lebanon. And I do believe that would be destabilising, indeed devastating, for Iraqi stability and sovereignty. Turning now specifically to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action regarding Iran's nuclear programme, the day this deal was signed was claimed to be a historic day, in the words of EU High Commissioner Federica Mogherini, who played a leading role in negotiating this deal on behalf of the EU, and recently appeared in Iran, as we saw, in a headscarf to meet the President. In a joint statement with Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, the deal was hailed as, quote, creating the conditions for building trust and opening a new chapter in our relationship. How wrong they were, I believe. I mean, in my capacity as chairman of the Iraq delegation, I've been following the talks between the West and Iran with a great deal of scepticism over the last few years. It's my assessment that the framework for the agreement on Iran's nuclear program poses a great risk, not only to Iraq and region, but to the international community as a whole. Just this week, Iran successfully test-fired a medium-range ballistic missile capable of striking American forces in the region as well as Israel. And this is the third such test since the nuclear agreement actually took effect in January. I'll say that again, the third test since the agreement actually took effect in January. And in March, Iran test-fired 2 ballistic missiles. One was emblazoned with the phrase, Israel must be wiped out, in Hebrew. And these tests are all in clear defiance of the recent UN resolution calling on Iran to cease work on its ballistic missile program. It's hardly doing that. I think it seems to be accelerating it. I do think, I'm afraid, this deal is tantamount to appeasement and demonstrates little regard to the Iranian regime's gross human rights violations that include executions of political opponents, repression of women, and little respect for the rights and freedoms of the Iranian people. This deal, by the way, has, according to the Washington Post, has freed $100 billion in assets for the Iranian regime. Now, 100 billion assets can go a long way, even part of it, towards funding terrorism or destabilising the region, in my view. Now, this is meant to be a moderate regime. It's the word moderate is used for President Rouhani, but more than 2,000 people have been hanged by this moderate Rouhani, a record high number for the past 25 years. It's the highest level in the world per head. Torture is omnipresent. Methods including beating, whipping, burning, rape and hunger are implemented by local amateur gangs, including the Mullah Judge and his guards. And And this is really business for you, as usual, for Ayatollah Khomeini. The West chose to turn a blind eye to these medieval practices in deference to a nuclear negotiation process in which such great expectation was invested. Nevertheless, negotiations that began over a decade ago as an international effort to prevent Iran's development of a nuclear stockpile have concluded with an agreement that actually concedes this very capability. It hasn't even succeeded in that level. Some senior Iranian officials have described this as a form of jihad by other means, this negotiation. With blatant defiance of UN resolutions, Iran has flipped the nuclear negotiation on its head. Iran's centrifuges have multiplied from around 100 at the beginning of the negotiation to 20,000 today, from 100 to 20,000. The Iranian regime was not even required to halt its nuclear enrichment program, including thousands of centrifuges spinning at the main Natanz enrichment facility. This deal actually legitimizes enrichment under certain limitations. Its commitment to, quote, no additional heavy water reactors or accumulation of heavy water in Iran will expire automatically after 15 years. So it's just a temporary pause. While Iran treated the mere fact of its readiness to negotiate as a concession, the weak, what I call groupthink mentality of the P5+1 and the EU has resulted in attempts to break every stalemate with the Iranians with fresh and over-generous proposals. These are my questions on the deal, specifically, technically. Has the P5+1 and the EU established procedures setting out how it will respond to different classes of Iranian violations? I mean, we've got evidence of that with these ballistic missile tests, but there doesn't seem to be any procedure on that. How can we ensure the international community can act with sufficient speed and efficiency to thwart a breakout to the Bonn? No. Has the Iranian regime been required to submit to anytime, anywhere inspections of any and all facilities suspected of engaging in rogue nuclear-related activity? No, it's got worse. Has there been a requirement for the shutdown and dismantlement of Iran's Arak heavy water reactor and plutonium production plant? No, this will be converted, not dismantled. And has Iran been required to shut down and dismantle the underground uranium enrichment facility built secretly at Fordo? No, this will be converted but not dismantled. And has Iran been required to halt its ongoing missile development? Well, clearly not. Not at all. So, with such safeguards are considerably lacking, or they're not even ensured at all, the nuclear deal shatters the painstakingly constructed sanctions regime that forced Iran to the negotiating table in the first place. Now, the Iranian program is just 3 months from assembling a nuclear weapon. Under this framework, for 10 years, Iran will never be further than 1 year away from a nuclear weapon, and after a decade, it will be within touching distance. In conclusion, while the mullahs in Iran continue to proclaim a revolutionary anti-Western concept of international order, we should refuse to accept the legitimacy of an agreement which, by freeing Iran from sanctions, risk empowering their regional hegemony and directly putting at risk the long-term security of Iraq and our friends there. In my view, the stability of Iraq and region as a whole is contingent on a nuclear-free and democratic Iran that genuinely respects human rights and the rule of law. And for this reason, I will continue to reject this nuclear agreement that, in my view, undermines these very principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for your presentation. I think there are very fundamental questions that you have posed, which do fall under the remit, obviously, of this committee, which is, of course, looking at EU-Iraq relations. But, of course, given the significance of this deal, the significance of the player that is Iran in terms of the region, and also the significance of the role that the EU played with others in bringing around this deal, these are legitimate questions correctly to ask in this committee and to see if we can obtain answers and get some accountability on them, because otherwise there will be an issue of a lack of public confidence in something that has been hailed as an international success, notwithstanding the need, of course, to make some progress. So, could I ask other colleagues who would like to take the floor at this stage in terms of questions to our guests or observations that they would like to make? Yes, Mr. Bilder.
Fair time? Or not? No translation, yes. Because it's such a marvelous language.
It's English,
So
English, French, Spanish, or
I had to make myself understandable in English. So apologize for my pronunciation, but I can assure you my daughter is far better as a teacher. Two short questions. Is it possible for Mr. Schwammenthal to comment on the Iranian-Kurdish relation with regard to the Kurdish regional government? That's important. The goals of this government, regional government, and the vision of Iraq in Iranian interest, are they compatible, or I think there should be here differences in future ideas about the future of Iraq. So my first question is, what can you say about the relations between Iran and Kurdish regional government? Are there conflicting interests regarding the future of Iraq? And then second question, latest report about military experts conclude that at the moment the non-proliferation regime for chemical weapons has broken down. And it is quite clear from several reports that the red line of President Obama is not anymore there. There is more routine when you look at the facts. Iran has a very cruel history in being confronted during the Iran-Iraq war with chemical weapons. Have you noticed that is occurring again in the confrontation in Syria and Iraq with the Revolutionary Guards and other forces I've learned from Iran's side, or allies? And by the way, the ally of Iran, Hezbollah, is also committed and has stockpiles of sea weapons by independent reports. For that, I don't want to speak about, as an historian, about the irony of history, but it is a very sad situation, to say the least, of course. That's my last sentence. When you look every day to the list of the fallen fighters on the Iranian side, be it on the Revolutionary Guard or other combatants, be it Afghans, for example, or others, can you comment on it?
Well, thank you. Well, no doubt that the Weltanschauung and philosophy of the Kurdish government and that of the regime in Tehran are more or less incompatible. We have here a relatively secular, open-minded society where women actually even are in the fighting forces, as we have seen, and so it's a very different view of running a society. Nevertheless, there seem to be also a working relationship between the autonomous or quasi-autonomous Kurdish region and Iran. Has been also an area where sanctions have been busted against Iran. So there is a working relationship. It's obviously in the Middle East a very complex world. where alliances and partnerships are sometimes bridge ideological or sectarian lines. It's not always as clear-cut and straightforward as we sometimes perhaps imagine it to be. I have also read with great concern about reports about various elements in the region having acquired chemical weapons or capability, including there are reports that ISIS forces in Syria may have such capability. It is indeed very frightening to have these extremist forces or Hezbollah, which I would count in the same category, having access to such dangerous weapons.
Thank you. Yeah, I just really on the chemical weapons aspect. I visited the front line with the Peshmerga opposite Mosul, but not far, about 15 kilometres from Mosul. And we were meant to be shown one part of the front line, and we were told we couldn't do it that day. We had to go to another one because there had been a mustard gas attack. And there had been a number of attacks. In fact, the Peshmerga have asked now for more equipment in terms of gas masks and protection. Where these are coming from, I mean, it could be Syria, it could be old stocks from Saddam's days, I don't know. But there is an element of the First World War about some aspects. It's very low-key at the moment. But it clearly, they don't have, the Peshmerga don't have the capability, apart from sort of water tankers, to try and counter it, you know, to wash it off or whatever. And I think it is a growing danger from ISIS in particular, which is of deep concern. I've also visited Israel, been close to Hezbollah, the Lebanon border there. And clearly the prospect, and Gaza Strip as well, that the prospect of missiles, in large numbers of missiles, getting more and more sophisticated. And this is what worries me about this 100 billion that we've basically handed back to Iran, is how many billions of that could go towards more missiles, because the evidence from security sources was in Lebanon and Gaza Strip that missiles were drying up, the numbers were drying up, because Iran was not sponsoring it. It didn't have the funds to sponsor it. And now we've given back them these funds. So I think the sort of the level of missile firing could go up quite significantly. And these missiles are not some toys, actually. They're getting more and more sophisticated and larger, and they could carry, you know, chemical weapons quite some large distances. So I think the situation is concerning, deeply concerning, because I think it will become more sophisticated, more dangerous over time.
Yes, the Iraqi ambassador.
ميرسي شكرا. مداخلة حول بعض المعلومات التي وردت. العلاقة بين تيار الصدر في العراق وإيران هي ليس علاقة عضوية أو حزبية. يعني أكاد أقول أنه التأثير السياسي لإيران على التيار الصدري هو يكاد يكون معدوم مقارنة مع الأحزاب السياسية العراقية الأخرى وحتى مع الكرد. هنالك تأثير سياسي لإيران على الأحزاب الكردية قد يكون أقوى من تأثير إيران على التيار الصدري، فليس هنالك. الملاحظة الأخرى، نقول دائما أنه الذكي والقوي هو الذي يملأ الفراغ في العمل السياسي، وحاليا ما نشهده في الشرق الأوسط والعالم العربي الذي ودع قبل أيام مرور 100 سنة على اتفاقية سايكس بيكو، الصراعات محتدمة وعديدة، وشركاء إيران في الوقت الحاضر ليس فقط بين قوسين العراق وهو دولة بدولة أو حزب الله أو النظام السوري. شركاء إيران في الوقت الحاضر روسيا، شركاء إيران في الوقت الحاضر دول بريكس، شركاء إيران في الوقت الحاضر الصين، شركاء إيران في الوقت الحاضر الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، ليس فقط بتوقيعها الاتفاق النووي، وإنما بحكم النظرة أو الرؤية الأوبامية إن صح التعبير اتجاه إيران. وأنا أقول أيضا أنه أعتقد التعامل والتفاوض بعلمية مع خصوم عقلاء هو أفضل من التعامل والتماشي مع أصدقاء مجانين. الذي نحن أمام ليس العراق فقط صراحة، وإنما العالم والمنطقة أمام هجمة فكرية عقائدية أمنية، ليس فقط على مستوى الفكر والعقيدة وإنما أمنيا، سواء في فرنسا سواء في بروكسل وأنا أتحدث إليكم جاءني خبر أنه انفجار سيارتين مفخختين قبل ساعة في بغداد في منطقة الكاظمية. نحن أمام هجمة إرهابية وجماعات تكفيرية تم تحديدها وتشخيصها، فدعونا شعوبا ومنظمات نتعاون جميعا لاجتثاث هذا الإرهاب، لمحاربة هذا الإرهاب، بدلا من للأسف الشديد الاهتمام بمسائل أخرى أو شيطنة بعض العقلاء الذين نستطيع أن نتفاهم معهم. أنا أعتقد الذي يفجر في بروكسل ليس الحشد الشعبي في العراق أو بين قوسين مثل ما تسموه ميليشيات الشيعية، لم تعتدي الميليشيات الشيعية وهذه الحشد الشعبي أصبح قوة عسكرية يتعامل تحت إمرة رئيس الوزراء. وقبل شهر ونص قام القنصل الأمريكي في البصرة بزيارة جرحى وشهداء الحشد الشعبي في البصرة، وأشاد بعملهم وبطولاتهم في محاربة داعش. أنا أتكلم كعراقي، كسفير العراق. استخدم العراق في تسعينيات القرن الماضي أو في ثمانينيات القرن الماضي مثل ما تعلمون، استخدم العراق كساحة للحرب مع إيران 10 سنوات تحت شعار القومية العربية. والآن للأسف الشديد هنالك جهود فكرية وميدانية تريد أن يستخدم العراق مرة أخرى لمحاربة إيران تحت عنوان ديني طائفي. فلو نتصرف بخطوة وراء خطوة، دعونا نجتث الإرهاب، دعونا نحارب الإرهاب. ومثل ما تفاهمنا مع هذه الدولة أو تلك الدولة أو هذه الجماعة أو تلك الجماعة، نتفاهم حول الاستحقاقات الجغرافية، الاستحقاقات السياسية، الاستحقاقات المصيرية في المنطقة، العلاقات العربية الإسرائيلية، العلاقات الإسرائيلية الفلسطينية. هذه أمور مهمة جدا.